Hey, what's up, Liron here. Thank you for joining me in today's video, and this is going to be a part of a two-video series. So for this one, I want us to focus on simple three-dimensional shapes, which is something I've talked about before, but this time I want us to take it a little slower and to really dive deeper on the different types of shapes and show you how I approach drawing these. And then in the next video, we're going to take this one step further and apply it to drawing figures, full figures, but in a very 3D oriented approach of really trying to understand what you're looking at, why it looks the way it does, and how we can portray it realistically. It's going to be aimed at beginners, but the concepts are still quite complex, but I'm sure you'll enjoy and learn something new, so let's get to it. So let's jump straight into it and how we can build our way basically up to the ability of drawing figures or something a little more complex. Now, I always send beginners to drawing cubes. That's the one thing I always say, and again, it's something I talked about before, but I want to tackle it from a different angle this time, and I promise I am going to work on a perspective course because I know so many people wonder about that, but let's set all of that aside. I want to show you something very important, okay? So when you look at a square, right? A square meaning a rectangle in which all the different sides are of equal length, right? So you have that kind of a, imagine, right? All of these are of about equal length, right? Kind of eyeballing it, right? Now, what will happen if we create a fully three-dimensional shape out of that basically recreates that? So this is maybe the top view, but the side view is going to be completely identical, right? So you can imagine that we're basically lifting this off the paper. So something like that from the side may look like, maybe, and I'm just going to move this a bit, may look like something like this, which is a cube. Okay, now I'm going to get to some practicalities in just a second, but I want us to take a bit of a deeper look at this shape, okay, this thing that's a cube. So what do we have here? We have a rectangle with all sides equal, right? And then this distance is also equal to these distances, okay? Now, it's not necessarily going to be equal on paper, but in reality, the structure that we have conveyed here is that, okay? This distance, if you measure it in real life, if you hold a Rubik's Cube, is going to be identical to this distance, to this distance, to this distance, to this distance, to everything. Now, this is what makes cubes a bit of a challenge and a bit problematic for some, because we run into a new problem, and it's something that you probably have thought of at some point, but maybe you haven't. We need to measure distances in space. So when we look at this, what we're doing is we have a flat piece of paper, and basically we drew a square on it, and it's very easy to measure in 2D because this is just the flat paper, right? We have up, down, left, right, and that's it. But when you create something that is truly three-dimensional and in space, now you have to start measuring distances in a way that's very different. And on top of it, the square poses, the cube poses a challenge that other forms don't have, which is everything is equal. Everything is of equal lengths, and we have to represent that. And this is very different from a box. A box in space can look like this, right? And all of the distances can be completely different, right? These may be of identical length to, these are of identical length, right? All of these could be, right? But these are different, right? Or you could have something different like that, where all of the distances are certainly different. So in this example, this is definitely different from this, is definitely different from this, right? The box and what it does, and why I highly recommend you learn how to draw it, what it does is force us to learn how to draw these distances in space in an equal way, okay? Now, the box has a couple of sides, and let me get my Rubik's Cube as always. It's just gonna make our example easier, right? So this is a real-life cube, a Rubik's Cube, right? And what happens is all of these distances are equal. This is equal to this, is equal to this, is equal to this. But when you actually look at it, the distances don't appear to be equal, right? This, if you actually measure it like that, it's shorter than this, right? Look at that. It's shorter because the one rule of perspective you want to learn is that things that are farther appear to be smaller. And because we're closer to this corner, everything shrinks in the distance. And actually, the closer I'll get this cube to the camera, the more of an extreme effect is going to be. The difference between how big this appears to this will grow greater and greater. Okay, so just as a kind of side note, we'll talk about that maybe later on. But here's where it gets a little tricky. Okay, so if we take this structure and we kind of impose it or superimpose it, or however you want to say it, on a three-dimensional area, right? What we'll get is something that looks like a different rectangle. So something like this, perhaps. Okay? And all of these distances are equal, but because this moves away from us, kind of like here, this moves away from us, this line appears to be shorter than this line. And if you measure, you'll actually notice that there's a bit of a difference between the two. And the way I achieve this is, if you have a line that's of this length, and you have another line that's of, let's say, shorter length, so not the same, but a little shorter, the way you achieve this is by converging these two lines that are parallel. In reality, they're parallel. Ruth digs through the sofa, but in actuality, on paper, they're going to be represented as converging lines, okay? And that's something really important to have in mind. So let's draw one cube from start to finish and see what we can get here, okay? So here's the way I like to do this. If I just start from this angle of looking dead in the front and seeing all sides equally, okay? The way I'll do this, let me put a blanket for Ruth. The way I would do this, if we're looking at it from the middle, is I'm gonna imagine a circle, and this is just theory, okay, so bear with me. I'm gonna imagine a circle, and if I were to divide it into equal thirds, those are gonna be my lines. Now, a circle is actually a great construction to use because these are all equal distances, assuming we drew it accurately, right? You could start it other way. You could draw a circle, find the center point, and out of that pull out lines that divide it into three identical parts, right? 2/3, okay? Now, let's just copy these lines basically. So let's not do any too serious converging here. Just copy these lines, and this is what you'd get by drawing a cube, right? And this is when we're looking at it straight ahead. This is something that you can learn like a robot and understand very easily how to do. The thing I want us to do is take it to the next step where you're able to, from imagination, rotate it, okay? So if we look at it straight ahead like that, and then I'm gonna rotate it a bit to the left, you see how the sides interact with one another. This one gets smaller, this one gets bigger. This one's kind of the same unless I tilt it, right? So let's take that same circle, right? Now here's the thing. Right now this is in the middle, but when we rotate it, it's no longer in the middle. So this circle we can't really use. And by the way, look at how, well, it's kind of equal. We can't use. The only use we have for that is find the center, divide it into thirds, at which point you can completely ignore the circle, right? Move forward with your life. And basically fill in the blanks. Just fill it in with parallel lines. You don't even have to do what I did earlier, which is converge them and make this shorter than this, right? You don't have to do that, and I will explain to you how that works in a different video, but basically, the closer we are, the more you'll have to do this. You know what, we can actually take a brief break and discuss this construction right now, because we're already here. So one thing that a lot of people wonder is, what happens if you make these lines converge a little more? What is the meaning of converging them? Because right now they're fully parallel. What if I go the complete extreme and I do something like this? What's the meaning of this kind of a construction? Where instead of using parallel lines, I'm using highly converging lines. What if I take this to even more extreme? Let me show you. Let's make this even more of an extreme angle. what's up with this structure? What's going on here, right? What is that? Is that even a cube anymore? What is that? So that'll be a very kind of boring, run-of-the-mill cube that you learn to draw by simply drawing two of these and connecting them by keeping those distances, though, longer, like that, right? I hope that makes sense. But then what happens if I make these lines converge more and converge even more? See? Look at how much these converge now, right? This is crazy. So let's just look at this and ask ourselves, what does this look more like? It looks more skewed, right? It looks a little more squeezed together. What actually happens in these examples is, in effect, the idea of, I don't want to talk about vanishing points, but here's what happens. This part here in the middle is much longer than these lines, right? And they represent parallel lines. Again, these same sides on the same side of the cube, right? Lines on the same side of the cube, right? The difference, the delta in length becomes a little more felt, right? Look at the difference between these two lines. This line, if I copy it here, look at where it reaches. This is the same length. Pretty crazy, right? Look at this line here. This is its length. Look at this. Look at that. See, it reaches all the way here. If I take this line, it's the same. These are same distances. Truly same on paper too, but here they're not. Look at this delta, and look at this delta between these two. What does this tell you? If the distance, if the delta between these two lines is much more significant, it means that this line is much closer to us, the viewer, than this line. And how does that happen? The answer is very simple, actually. We simply got closer to the box, to the cube here. We simply got closer to this corner of the cube, making this appear much longer than that. And how can you recreate this effect? Let me show you. So it's the same with the camera. You have these two pens, right? This one's closer. Look at how it looks. It appears to be longer, right? Appears to be longer. The closer I hold it up to the camera, the more extreme the distance gets, right? If I hold these two at identical distances and lift them up closer to the camera, right? The relations, the delta, the difference between their apparent lengths is gonna grow more extreme the closer one of them is to the actual camera, okay? Another extreme example of this, if I hold it up like that, how much larger is this? And sorry, I know it doesn't focus. How much larger is this compared to that? In reality, they're the same size. This top part of the cap and the bottom part are pretty much the same size. But the closer one edge gets to us, the more extreme the difference, the delta grows. So, the more you converge the lines, the more you represent a scene in which we are closer to it. Let me give you another example, okay? Let's say we're looking at a floor, tiles, it's kind of the same thing. And what we're gonna get here is a tiled floor, again, checkers, like this, right? So this is a floor. And look at what happens here to these tiles that are closest to us. They really get skewed, right? They really get skewed. What happens is these are usually outside of our field of vision. We will only see maybe this part, right? We don't see this kind of skewing in real life. It basically doesn't exist, right? I don't know how to explain the optics of it fully. I will try and explain them though in a future video, but just to give you an example, this is why this kind of a thing happens, okay? Because what happens is we cannot be as close to this tile and still see all of this scene. Because to get this skewing, you need to be as close to this, for example, like this corner here. So I want to show you how this will work in a more complete scene, but still quite fast. So this is our horizon line. This is actually an imaginary line. Horizon line doesn't truly exist. It's just a line that represents our point of view. That's actually all we need to know right now. But on this horizon line, if we want to draw a cube that is not straight ahead like this, but rather rotated, what happens is And this is something I don't think I explained in this particular way. When the cube faces straight toward you, all of the parallel lines basically move away from us, right? And it's what's called a one-point perspective. So if we were going to put just one point on the horizon line, what we'll essentially get is that cube. Something like that, right? It's just the top plane that's moving away from us. Here's why one-point perspective is not enough for most cubes. Because one-point perspective is for when you have one set of parallel lines. They all converge to this vanishing point. What usually happens is we have more than one. And this is the classic example, right? The cube. Why? Because we have two sets of parallel lines. 1 and 2. And every one of these sets requires its own vanishing point. And what would happen is if you rotate the scene enough, these lines will converge to this one-point perspective. So we have a one-point perspective if you ignore the rest of the scene, but as you rotate it, this other vanishing point that's right now at infinity, because these lines are fully parallel and will never meet when we hold a cube like this, fully parallel lines. The more we rotate it, that vanishing point is going to jump straight out of infinity and onto our paper, like this. It's going to represent one side of the cube, and this is going to represent another side of the cube. And for now, we will ignore the element of height, because there's a third vanishing point as well. That's the same concept. If this cube is facing towards us, as soon as we rotate it, we've essentially brought a vanishing point from infinity down below. And if we rotate it like this, we've essentially brought a vanishing point from above. Okay? But let's let that go for now. Let's focus on this structure, like that. So how do we recreate this? If I'm going to hold it up to the side like this, we're just going to use lines coming out of these vanishing points. Because remember, these lines represent the two different parallel planes of the cube. Right plane to the right vanishing point, left plane to the left vanishing point. Okay? And then, once you have these lines in, you can pretty much close off the sides and connect using more parallel lines that converge to those same vanishing points. Okay, now I made the cube a little elongated. It should probably end here. But that's a very simple cube for you. And this is how the rules of perspective work. These vanishing points don't exist in real life. It's a mathematical construct to show us where these lines meet. Okay? Now, this is our scene. This is our field of vision. What would happen if we make our field of vision wider? Let me show you. Same vanishing points. We'll get the skewed cube from before. So that if you compare this distance to this distance, you can see the gap here, right? Now if you compare this distance to this distance, not as much of a gap here. This is ever so slightly longer than this, right? So this actually teaches us a few important things. The closer we are to the box, the more significant perspective becomes. The farther we are from it, the less significant it is. Let me give you an example. Buildings. When you look at a cityscape from afar, you don't see all of these different elements. All you see is just a bunch of buildings. Something like that. Why? Because perspective is not as significant for objects that are in the far distance. So what will happen is, even if you look at a building right from above, so if you look at a cube from above, you'll see something like this, right? You'll see the bottom, right? And something like that, maybe. A little too skewed, but that's basically it, right? Now, if you look at a building from afar, you won't see this strong of an angle up top unless you're standing right under it, right? At its nose. If this is a building and you're like here, not at its nose, at its base, right? And you're looking up at it, you will see this angle, or a similar angle. But when you look at it from afar, you'll see maybe something like this. Maybe. And so perspective is less significant. The closer we are to the object, the more significant it is. This is why sometimes fisheye lens effect is so satisfying, because it really shows you that skewing, that extreme change, right? That's extreme foreshortening as well, which is a different concept I want to talk about in the future. So that will be it for boxes and how they're kind of influenced. Now, let's talk about how to learn how to draw them from every angle, okay? Because right now you start to develop maybe an understanding, you start to realize what this structure is like. And this is not an easy task in and of itself, right? You think a cube, I'm familiar with that, I know what it looks like. Everything is cubes these days, right? Houses are cubes, cars are cubes or boxes, right? Everything is cube-like. But this is such an elusive concept that it's really easy to think you know something when you don't. So let me show you once again. Let's say we're looking at this from this kind of an angle, okay, from above. Not rotated, just from above. The top square may look like something like this, right? So that's the top plane of the cube. I even exaggerated it a bit. I made it a little too thin. It should be thicker, but it's gonna still be okay. You know what? For our purpose, let me rotate it a bit. I want to really show you this effect. So it goes like this, maybe. A bit more of an upper angle. We're looking at it from above, okay? Here's the problem we run into. Because we know that in space, in reality, this distance right here is identical to this distance. These two are identical. But on paper, look at what happens here, right? This line moves away or towards us rather, doesn't matter. So it appears if we measure it shorter, much shorter than this. So the problem we run into is, how do I know how short it is? Is it this long? Is it this long? I know for sure it's shorter than the actual length, right? It cannot be as long as this because it has to be shorter because we're looking at it from a distance, but just how short it is. These are questions that unfortunately I cannot give you a concrete answer. The one thing I can say is you really need to practice this with repetition until your eyes recognize this. So let's try a distance. Let's try to get it up to here. And then we'll just continue. A somewhat parallel line, a somewhat parallel line, somewhat parallel line, somewhat parallel line. Now just use your eyes here. Does this make sense to you? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. To me, it immediately looks off. It looks so much, way too short. Okay, way too short. Now, there are actually ways of measuring it, but I need a refresher on those. So once I get this refresher, I will talk about it. It's not 100% accurate, but it is a bit more accurate of a way to measure. But for now, to me, my instincts scream that this is wrong. So let's try a different length here and see what we can get. So let's try this. Something like that. This looks a lot better to me. And we definitely know it's going to be shorter than this, right? Because this is the same length. It cannot be that because we're looking at it and it moves away from us, okay? We're seeing more of this plane than we're seeing of these two planes. So then that's how you kind of ballpark it. You think, okay, is this accurate? Doesn't look, looks a little off. This accurate, looks a little off. And usually, even if you're not as experienced, you can tell at least on a binary level. Is this right or is this wrong, right? Is this on or off, or is it the other way around? I'm never sure with the old devices, but you can at least in a binary fashion say this seems okay or this feels off. And that's the muscle I want you to train. Now you can always use photo reference, and after you go with your intuition, measure on the photo itself. Actually measure on the photo and figure out, was I accurate or was I not, okay? And this is only by introducing some tilting, right? If we do this kind of a tilt, as opposed to this, right? This kind of a tilt, then look at what happens to this angle. It opens up, it looks like this now, but when we do this, it opens up. And these are the things you need to learn with experience, okay? So let's finish off this top of the cube. And what's up with this line, right? Is it of similar length? Is it of different length? You have to start asking these questions. These move away from us. These appear to be shorter, slightly shorter. So this line is going to be slightly longer. So not up to here, but a little longer. And then you drop these two lines and you ask yourself, does this look right? Or does it look a little off? Right? To me, it looks actually almost accurate. Maybe I'd go even shorter here. maybe I'd go a little shorter here. And then you grab the reference photo you use, take your own photos if you have to, and you start comparing and asking yourself, is this accurate? I think I made this backside a little too short. It should be of similar length at this weird of an angle, right? So you have to do this constantly. Now, there is an added element of challenge here. Let me take a sip of my coffee. This is going to be a long one, so buckle up. But I think we're actually close to wrapping it up. So this is tilting. What's up with rotation? What happens when we rotate the cube? Okay? What's that going to be like? What kind of effect is this going to lead to? So let me try and show you. If I look at this box like this, what I see is this angle and then this angle. But what if I rotate it like that? I see this angle and then this angle, and these are vastly different. Can you see? The base for these sketches is going to be completely different right from the start. You have to train yourself to see this, see these planes and see these angles. The more, when they're equal, they're of similar angles, right? And the tilt will influence how closed off it is, right? But these two lines are going to create a similar distance if we were to drop this parallel line here, right? Just the opening of the angle is what changes, right? So the lower we look at it, the more open the angle is, and then the more closed it is until it's just a square, right? See? Closed, closed, and then more open. But these are going to be equal. But as soon as we rotate, they're no longer equal. They're different. And what's a logical way of figuring out they're different? Let me show you. If I'm going to rotate it this way, this line is moving away from me ever so slightly, but this one's going straight into the distance, right? And if I do this even more, it's just going away from me directly. Well, this line is kind of, just very gently moving away. See, now it's fully parallel, and these lines are just parallel lines that'll never meet, right? But this line is moving away from us, so it gets shorter, right? So this line is longer than this line because this is parallel to us and this moves away from us. And look at the difference here in actual measurement, right? That's the length of this line. In reality, they're the same, always. But on paper, things change. And this is what you have to understand. You have to start seeing these angles cleanly. And not just for this, for everything together. I need to get you to a point where no matter what direction I'm going to rotate this thing, you're going to be able to tell, okay? And as I'm filming this video, I think I'm going to turn part two is going to be postponed to part 3, and I'm going to take another kind of a shortcut because I need to show you one more thing before we move on to actual figures. So we'll probably do this a 3-video series. So see, as I rotate this, you need to be able to control these angles and figure them out, right? Even if you're looking at it dead ahead like this, you need to understand this is the middle line, right? Now these lines here are a little farther from us, just a little. This is close, moving back in distance, so it's gonna be a little shorter, so not that same distance, but a little shorter, right? But then you have to figure out how farther from us it is, right? So there's a lot to understand here. The one thing I can say, the one thing you can use is just a lot of photo references, try it out intuitively, and then measure and see how off you were, right? The rules of perspective will help you in terms of these lines are converging to some vanishing point. So I know in my imagination, when I draw these parallel lines, I slightly converge them, right? So that they will meet somewhere. But that somewhere is going to be like way outside, right? But if I take a more extreme approach to this, something really extreme, like a box that's very skewed, let's follow those parallel lines, right? So this line goes here, this line goes there, and maybe they'll meet somewhere here, right? And I know that if I make this a building, I'm gonna follow this same vanishing point, and I developed an intuition for how tilted these lines should be. and how much more tilted they should be the more they move farther away from us. Same for this side. I don't need the grid. I can actually guesstimate where it's going to be and how much more tilted it's going to be. That will only come with practice, more and more and more and more. Now, there are tricks for measuring, and I've shown you this, I believe, in the past, measuring equal distances. So if you draw an X through the corners, and then you draw a line that basically cuts this down the middle, so these two parts are identical. Now, if you drop a line through here, that's going to end up where the even distance is. So this is equal to that. And I've shown you this in a recent video, right? So you can measure some things, but you need sometimes to relate them to something. So you can't go off of that. You can't go off of any tacky approaches and tricks. You have to actually develop an understanding for the basic structure of the cube. Once you get that down, cylinders, ovals, spheres, they all become much, much easier. Okay, so I want you to work on that. Again, there are no rules, there are no guides to follow. All you can do is draw, check and test yourself. Was I accurate? Was I inaccurate? And then basically fix your mistakes and learn and improve your eyes and improve your ability to gauge these angles without measuring them. Because these angles are all over the place. They change all the time, right? This is basically a 90-degree angle, but as soon as I do this, it's no longer a 90-degree angle, right? There's this imaginary circle is divided into unequal angles, right? So you have this, and then you have 1, 2, 3, like that, right? It's divided. The whole sum, of course, is 360 always, which is something I haven't mentioned. But in what constellation, in what angle, okay? You have to learn these things. I hope this was helpful. Let me know in a comment down below. I know this was a pretty long video. The next one we're gonna jump into spheres. I'm gonna show you some cool tricks, but hopefully this still helps. And this is the hardest thing to do and the most important thing to do, because a cube is as specific as it gets. It has a top side, it has a front side, it has a right side, left side, back side, down, lower side. It has everything. You can represent everything using a cube. You can represent any direction in space, and you can build on top of it everything. Faces, limbs, whatever you want. So thank you so much for watching, and I will catch you in the next vid.